I'm an old school teacher, and so I've got a little visual aid that I need you to all be part of as we share a couple of closing thoughts. So I'm going to take the end over here to where Marie is, and what I want you to do as I begin to share a little bit is just to unroll this this cord that's going to come around, so that in a minute or two we're all holding a piece of it, and it's made its way through the whole group. So as it's unrolling, let me just offer a reflection or two, a little bit of teaching. I went into the family photo album, and I dug out some photos for coming here today. My great-grandfather and a couple of my several great uncles that were part of World War I, and I took them out to have a little look at them, and I was imagining, you know, on this day 100 years ago, the conversation they might have been having as they lounged in a comfortable trench somewhere in Europe, and talked about what had happened. And you know, can we sort of think in our heads and hear them, and they're saying, "Oh my, it's been the war to end all wars. What a glorious time we've had. What heroics, what wonderful deeds have passed in these years that have gone by," and they're chatting there back and forth to each other. Is that the conversation you can imagine as they sit there? I would say no. I would say bullshit is what they would have said if they had heard people using that kind of language to talk about the violence and the misery of war. They would have probably talked instead about what they had seen of the 10 million people whose lives had been taken. They would have talked about beautiful farms that were ruined and destroyed. They would have talked about groups of widows and orphans that were walking the roads of Europe as the war ended. Those would be the kinds of things that they would have more likely been talking about. And yet there's an even worse tragedy to this, and that's that none of these people actually came back to Canada. My grandfather grew up as one of those orphans because of the war to end all wars, and his father was buried over there somewhere in those fields. And so I think that's a thing that makes it hard to celebrate or to be appreciative in any way, for me at least. But now let me talk about why we shared this little string around amongst ourselves. Thanks, I'll just borrow those back. Part of the reason I wanted to do it is because 20 years later, this guy, also from my family album, was involved in yet another war, and this is a picture of my father in 1939. And so this is a cord that, if you've looked at the little colored strips on it as it's moved around, it's got names of various wars since the war to end all wars that are strewn along it. And that's only a little sample of about 230 wars in the last 100 years that are considered to have been kind of official in the record of wars. Another 60 million people that have died in wars since the war to end all wars. And so that's what happens, is war after war, grandfather dies, 20 years later, son is there to be part of it. And so what I really want to leave with us today in this closing minute is just a message really to myself as much as to any of you, and that is that to remember, if remember is kind of a mushy sentimentality, is of no value at all. To remember means we have to learn, and we have to be prepared to make change. We have to say we're not going to allow things to be the same. Now, that cord not only has little pieces of paper on it that remind us of hundreds of unnecessary wars and millions of unnecessary deaths. All those pieces of paper are along one single cord, and that cord is even more important for us to remember. Not the individual endless seeming stream of wars, but what's the cord that connects all those? It's something we all know and we all rage out against time after time through the years. That's the cord that speaks of nationalism and militarism and capitalism and racism, imperialism. That's what binds all these 230 plus wars, these 70 million deaths in the last 100 years or so. That's what binds them together, and that's what we have to be prepared to continue to do something about, to speak up and be a voice for. World War I grew out of conditions around the globe that weren't very different than the ones we have now. Some people enjoying immense prosperity, robber barons abusing the environment, abusing vulnerable people for cheap labor, and out of that prosperity there was immense inequality. They say that in Great Britain at the time of World War I, 1%, remember the 1%, 100 years ago, 1% of the people controlled 3/4 of the wealth in the United Kingdom. Things aren't changing, and so our remembering has to be linked always to that word change. We're going to make it different. And that's the last message that the cord has. The cord not only reminds us that there are certain evils that connect all these wars and are down in the roots of all these wars, that cord also reminds that we, the people, together are strong. And we hold hands, we link ourselves together, and we do have the ability to make that change. It might seem discouraging sometimes, but we don't give up. We continue to say, peace is not going to fall from the sky like that snow shower a few minutes ago by magic. It's going to come because we work hard. We remain committed and firm in our determination to see an end to war and the flourishing of peace amongst us. No war ends by another war. War ends when we remember the messages that we've heard today of love and of working together to create a better kind of world. And so I look back on that 100 years with grief at the millions of lives and the destruction that's happened, but I also look back at that 100 years and say, all through it, there's a steady stream of us who say, we are going to work for peace. We are not going to give in to the demands of war that are so destructive of all of us. Thanks.